Let's begin. Thank you for coming out on the first real winter day of the semester. I'm Jacob Levy. I'm the coordinator of the research group on constitutional studies, a unit of the Jan P. Linde Center for the Study of Freedom and Global Orders in the Ancient and Modern Worlds. I begin by acknowledging that McGill University sits on land that has long been used as a site of meeting and exchange among indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge our debt to the diverse peoples who have long used this land. The research group on constitutional studies encompasses scholarship from around McGill, particularly in law, political science, and philosophy, around the study of fundamental constitutional level governance, norms, and ethics. It studies the foundational and fundamental institutions and rules of governance. The RGCS lecture series, nearly as old as RGCS itself, brings leading scholars to McGill, asking them to present their research and their ideas in ways that are broadly accessible to an advanced student audience, aiming to overcome sharp distinctions between the world in which researchers and scholars visit and speak to researchers and scholars, and other people from outside academia speak to undergraduates. We have found that excellent scholars are routinely also excellent teachers, and we ask them to come here and show that to our students. In turn, we ask our advanced students in the social sciences and humanities and law, particularly those in and around RGCS, to come prepared to listen, to think, and to engage. It is an absolute delight to welcome to McGill and to RGCS the astonishing Asha Rangappa. Asha Rangappa holds degrees from Princeton University and Yale Law School, the Yale Law School. She has been a Fulbright scholar. She has clerked for the First Circuit Court of Appeals of the United States in Puerto Rico. And upon finishing her law degree, she became a special agent for the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the United States, specializing in counterintelligence. After several years as an FBI agent, she returned to the academy, becoming assistant and then associate dean at Yale, the Yale Law School. I don't know for sure that 31 years old is the youngest that any person has held the title of dean at an Ivy League university, but I suspect it's got to be true, and I choose to believe it. It would be mathematically hard for there to be much younger than that. And she has spent her subsequent career at Yale, where she is currently assistant dean and senior lecturer in the Jackson School of Global Affairs. Her research, teaching, and writing has spanned topics from constitutional reform in Colombia to national security and counterintelligence law, to gun control and the constitutionality of regulating firearm possession in the United States, to the study of misinformation and how misinformation distorts public and democratic debate. She rose to global prominence when it became the case that having a specialist in counterintelligence and the ways that counterintelligence intersected with law enforcement in general and with the FBI in the United States in particular became a topic of keen interest with respect to the constitutional separation of powers and a then newly elected president of the United States. And she has been one of the leading commentators on how it is that law enforcement interacts with counterintelligence studies, which was, of course, a central topic of concern in the United States during the Trump administration. And building from that, has established herself as a critically important public voice on how it is that the rule of law survives under conditions of threat when the law enforcement apparatus itself comes under question. And it's around questions like that that I've asked her to speak today. I'll conclude on a personal note. There are lots of kinds of joys of teaching, and there are lots of kinds of students it's a joy to teach. But one of the kinds of joys of teaching is encountering simply the smartest people you'll ever meet. Most of the smartest people I've met in my life have been my students. And it's a sheer delight to watch a really brilliant student just take the material and run, and start thinking new thoughts and moving in new directions beyond what anything you think you've done. You were just the opportunity, the excuse for this really astonishing mind to get to work. I met the very first one of those students in my life in the very first class for which I TA'd as a graduate student at Princeton University. And I learned something of my love of teaching from the fact that one of the very first people I taught was Asha Rangappa.
Thank you so much, Jacob. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. And I was wondering if you were going to mention that you were my teacher at Princeton. I was thinking as I prepared this that I might regress to my, 19-year-old self and wanting to make sure that I got the gold star. So I hope that you especially and all of you enjoy this talk. So if I were giving this lecture to an American audience, I would have called it How to Get Rid of a President. As the Trump presidency revealed, it's actually really, really hard, at least in America. This stands in contrast to the prosecution of former presidents, which, while perhaps not easy, is not exactly rare. Since 2000, former leaders of 76 countries have been prosecuted or jailed. Since 1980, about half the world's countries have prosecuted or jailed a former head of state, not including impeachments or leaders deposed by a coup. Peru leads the pack, having arrested or charged every president but one who served from 1985 to 2018. Just last week, Brazil's Supreme Court approved an investigation into former President Bolsonaro for his role in the Capitol riots that took place in Brasilia earlier this month. So what is it specifically about the executive office and its relationship to the institution designed to investigate and prosecute crimes that makes it so difficult to pursue charges while a leader is in office? That's the question that many Americans, and indeed people around the world, asked repeatedly during the Trump administration. Indeed, 2 years after leaving office, former President Trump, who was investigated by Special Counsel Robert S. Mueller III for 10 potential counts of obstruction of justice, was impeached once for abuse of power, then a second time for inciting an insurrection, remains at large. He is currently under investigation by another special counsel for crimes related to the attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6th for illegal retention of classified information at Mar-a-Lago. He therefore offers a rich case study in the flaws of the U.S. federal prosecutorial model when it comes to holding the chief executive accountable, especially while in office. Isolating the institutional design features that make prosecuting and removing a president or chief executive difficult or impossible can help illuminate policy solutions to address or close those gaps. My talk today will proceed in 3 parts. First, I'll look at the institutional landscape for the placement of the prosecutorial function within the government and why each model presents particular problems of prosecutorial independence. I'll home in on the American and British Commonwealth model, which places primary responsibility for law enforcement in the executive branch, and highlight the specific tension created by this design. Next, I'll cover the 3 main obstacles to ensuring prosecutorial independence in efforts to hold the executive accountable while he remains in office. I'll focus mainly on the American example, but draw on some recent controversies regarding prosecutorial independence between the Prime Minister and the Attorney General of Canada. Finally, I'll offer some potential solutions tailored to each of these institutional loopholes, as it were, highlighting how and why some might be more impactful than others. So let's turn to the institutional landscape. There's no single model for where the prosecutorial function should fall within a government system, and various countries have designed their institutions differently. Oh, sorry. The one that you all are familiar with and that I'm familiar with is the placement of the prosecutorial function in the executive branch. This is the US, this is Canada, South Africa, Germany. Then you have the placement of the prosecutorial function in the judicial branch. This is how the inquisitorial system works, and we see this in Italy, Bulgaria, and France. Then there is a model of actually creating an entirely separate autonomous institution to initiate and pursue investigations and prosecutions. And Chile, Hungary, Guatemala are all examples of these. Regardless of where it falls, there exists a tension between two goals. First is the independence to work unimpeded without influence and political pressure, and then proper checks to avoid prosecutorial abuse. We don't want a prosecutor to have carte blanche to just pursue everything and go on fishing expeditions. I will focus on the specific conflict that arises between these two goals when the prosecutorial function falls within the executive branch. But all of these models present a tension between these two goals to some degree. To situate the US and Canadian model in the institutional landscape, it's worth highlighting how the tension between the two goals arises in the other types of models. The pitfalls of placing the prosecutorial function in the judiciary, for example, is highlighted by the example of Colombia, which faced a rule of law crisis in the 1980s and 90s due to narco trafficking. In the inquisitorial system, common throughout most of Latin America, judges were responsible for both investigating and adjudicating crimes, making them a target for narco traffickers who often presented them with the choice of plata or plomo, silver or lead. Bribing or eliminating the judge therefore nipped the investigation in the bud entirely. The lack of separation between the enforcement and adjudicatory functions also meant that more generally, there lacked a truly independent check on prosecutorial decisions by a neutral decision maker, as is the case where the prosecutorial function falls under the executive branch. Then you have the judiciary as a separate check. A similar issue, but more directly involving an inability to hold leaders and even former leaders accountable, arose in Chile, which also had an inquisitorial system. Having packed the courts, as it were, with loyalists, Pinochet having packed the courts, investigating human rights abuses that took place under the Pinochet regime was all but impossible in the aftermath of the dictatorship. So we have here, y'all know who this is? Pablo Escobar. This is Lara Bonilla. He was the Minister of Justice whom Escobar assassinated. This is a picture of a siege on Colombia's Palace of Justice, which was essentially attacked by M19, which is a guerrilla group that was financed by the narco traffickers. That was in 1985, and in that siege, about 6,000 pages of evidence relating to extradition of the drug traffickers was burned, and several Supreme Court justices also died. And this is Augusto Pinochet. As a result of these problems, both Colombia and Chile instituted legal reforms to transition to the third autonomous model described before. That is, the creation of an autonomous entity responsible for initiating and pursuing prosecutions. In Colombia, for example, the 1991 Constitution created the Office of the Attorney General of Colombia, the Fiscalía General de la Nación, which is separate from the judiciary, but not directly under the executive branch. The Attorney General is chosen by the Colombian Supreme Court from a slate presented by the president. Similarly, Chile's national prosecutor, Fiscalía Nacional, is appointed by the president based on a proposal presented by the Supreme Court and approved by 2/3 of the Senate. The office itself, however, is autonomous of the other branches. In contrast to the inquisitorial system, which primarily creates the vulnerability to political pressure and interference, the autonomous model creates the problem of too much prosecutorial discretion without accountability. One of Colombia's former attorneys general, for example, was criticized for failing to bring human rights investigations, and a former regional prosecutor in Chile was found to have been negligent in pursuing a sex crimes case against a former political figure. These examples highlight a sub-problem that arises in affording the prosecutorial function too much independence, especially when it comes to holding the executive accountable. How to police the failure of a prosecutor to investigate. Most analyses of checks on prosecutorial independence focus on the consequences of selective or politically motivated prosecutions. This presents as a problem between government power and individual rights. In such cases, creating an adequate judicial check may be adequate. By contrast, even an independent judiciary can't force the initiation of an investigation. Indeed, it's easier to see abuse of a decision to prosecute than non-prosecution. Declination of investigations pursued against the chief executive while in power thus becomes a problem and can provide valuable cover to powerful actors. So let's turn to the executive branch model. These tensions come into stark relief in a different way when, as in the United States and Canada, the nation's chief law enforcement officer is beholden to and indeed appointed by the head of the executive branch. The U.S. presents this dilemma in the Constitution itself, offering only the Take Care Clause as a guide to how the chief executive should fulfill his enforcement role. Former President, wait, I thought that I had something. Former President Richard Nixon himself interpreted this charge quite broadly, as you can see from his interpretation. The Take Care Clause is, he shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And as far as Nixon was concerned, if the president does it, that means it's not illegal. The two extremes of the executive branch model are embodied by the extremes represented by each of these individuals. On the one hand, we have former President Nixon, who saw his Justice Department as answerable to him personally rather than to the rule of law. The complete conflation of the law enforcement function with Nixon's political interests meant that there was no buffer between the two. On the other hand, an attempt to create legal distance between the chief executive and the prosecutorial function, represented here by independent counsel Kenneth Starr. You guys are, I'm way older than you guys. Do you have any idea who this is? Okay. He investigated President Bill Clinton in the Monica Lewinsky case. Yes, who conducted a, shall we say, wide-ranging 3-year investigation into Bill Clinton, has the potential to become a runaway stagecoach that may be itself be influenced by corrupt motives or political considerations. How do we strike a balance between these two extremes? The Nixon example and its through line to Trump highlights 3 main obstacles to establishing prosecutorial independence in the context of executive accountability. I'm sorry, my slides are a little bit out of order. Okay. The first and most obvious, but also the most theoretically complex, is that the chief executive oversees enforcement, creating an obvious conflict of interest when it comes to investigating him or her, and the opportunity for undue influence. The second is that the chief executive has access to other levers of power, legal power, that can thwart or undermine an investigation. And the third is that to the extent that an investigation can proceed, the criminal code may not be up to the task of covering the conduct or the harm caused by the conduct of the chief executive. So we'll turn to each of these. First, at the executive as the enforcer. This is the most obvious and thorniest conflict within the executive model, both in theory and in practice. So let's look at practice first. Assuming we can agree on the theory of prosecutorial independence from the executive, what should it look like in practice? We intuitively understand that there needs to be some firewall between the chief executive and the chief prosecutor, but under what circumstances? Is it, to quote U.S. Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell, "I know it when I see it"? That's from a court case where he was talking about obscenity, by the way. This seems simple enough, but in fact, these seem to be the principles implicated in the SNC Lavalin controversy that, I'm sorry, my notes, actually, excuse me. The literature on prosecutorial independence distills the best practices concerning the relationship between the chief executive and chief prosecutor as follows. Contact between the executive and the prosecutor should be transparent, regularized, not case specific, and no instructions should be given to prosecute or not prosecute specific cases. This seems simple enough, but there are legitimate reasons that communication may need to happen. I'll talk first about how this came up in the SNC Lavalin controversy. Are you all familiar with this? I was just doing some research. I don't know, was this all over the news? Okay. So this came to light in 2019. In that case, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his staff repeatedly had contact with then Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould to overrule her decision not to grant a deferred prosecution agreement, a DPA, to the engineering firm SNL Lavalin. SNL Lavalin was facing trial on fraud and corruption charges based on payments made to Libyan officials over a 10-year period. A DPA would avoid criminal penalties, which had the potential to cost thousands of jobs and revenue. The Prime Minister's interference was found to have violated the Conflict of Interest Act. We also saw the same situation arise with President Trump and his interaction with former director of the FBI, James Comey. How do we distinguish between these cases, or what are some of the differences between these cases? Some history on why legitimate reasons that communication may need to happen between the executive and the Attorney General. In the early days of the U.S. Republic, U.S. presidents directly influenced decisions to prosecute. President George Washington ordered the prosecution of participants in the Whiskey Rebellion, and President John Adams controlled prosecutions involving his political enemies under the Sedition Act. These cases arguably involved issues of national security. Diplomatic interests may be in play, such as when the White House ordered the Southern District of New York to release an Indian diplomat who was charged with abusing her domestic servant. She was allowed to return to India to avoid a diplomatic kerfuffle between the United States and India. And other cases, such as the charges against Julian Assange, founder of WikiLeaks, for aiding and abetting the illegal procurement of classified information, would have undoubtedly been discussed with White House officials due to the First Amendment implications. However, we do feel that these are different than Trump's secret dinner with former FBI Director James Comey, requesting that he lay off of the investigation into Michael Flynn, and his later firing of the FBI director himself. I would also argue that it's different than the Trudeau example. You guys have much stricter laws than we do. So to help elucidate the difference, let's go to the theory. Unfortunately, in the United States, we have little guidance from the Constitution on prosecutorial independence. It's generally accepted as a necessary precondition for the impartial administration of justice, and yet there is no clear-cut theory for why that independence ought to exist when the executive branch is charged with enforcement of the laws. In fact, the main theory which has significant support among conservative legal scholars in the United States cuts in the exact opposite direction. The unitary executive theory is based on the historical understanding of the vestiture clause of the Constitution, which is this. Without getting too into the weeds, the thrust of the unitary executive theory is that the president alone controls the executive branch, including its agencies and inferior officers. They are, in effect, merely expressions of his executive power. And Congress or the courts may not interfere with the exercise of that power. The Bush administration relied heavily on this theory to vastly expand presidential war powers under the Commander-in-Chief Clause. But proponents of the unitary executive also see no daylight for Congress or the courts in the president's exercise of the Take Care Clause, effectively the law enforcement provision, to wit, the president has the power to start and stop investigations at will or to order his attorney general to do so. He also has the power to hire and fire inferior officers. In other words, the president can't obstruct justice. He can't, after all, obstruct himself in the exercise of his own constitutional authority. And any efforts by Congress to criminalize the president's efforts to influence investigations or prosecutions would be a violation of the separation of powers. Nixon would be on board with that. You might be thinking, wow, that's a bit much. And I'd agree. But it is in many ways a strong argument given the sparse text. In fact, the traditional independence of the Justice Department and the FBI is one based on norms, which has evolved over time. But there is nothing in the constitutional text of the United States that requires any distance between the president and law enforcement or prosecutors. The Constitution doesn't even explicitly mention the position of the Attorney General, let alone the FBI. The FBI is created through delegated authority to the Attorney General, who is merely an inferior officer in the executive branch. And even the norms surrounding prosecutorial independence have only been consistently in place since about 1940. It's worth noting that the Federal Criminal Code didn't really expand until the 1900s. Most of it was state law in the United States, and the body of federal law came about after the turn of the 20th century, which may offer a partial explanation for why that norm evolved so late. Further, any attempts by Congress to legislatively mandate a division between the president and the Attorney General would likely have constitutional deficiencies largely related to the unitary executive interpretation. In other words, the U.S. Congress would likely not be able to pass a conflict of interest act that applied to the president and his subordinate officers. So what are some alternative theories that can help us? First is a structural argument articulated by Professor Todd David Peterson at George Washington Law School, who suggests that separation of powers principles can inform an understanding of the executive branch's relationship with the Justice Department. Specifically, Peterson argues that both the legislative and judicial branches are required to observe prosecutorial independence by playing a clear but limited role in the administration of justice, and both are prohibited from encroaching on a prosecutor's decision to initiate or decline a prosecution. He further argues that the underlying principle for these limitations is not preventing encroachment on the executive's prerogatives, but to prevent arbitrary punishments. Peterson argues that the implicit limitation on arbitrary punishment applies also to the executive branch, and therefore prohibits him from influencing particular cases. The second is a textual argument from Professors Ethan Lieb and Jed Sugarman of Fordham Law School. They highlight that the president's obligation to take care that the laws be faithfully executed imposes a fiduciary obligation on the executive. The same obligation is echoed in the presidential oath of office, in which he swears to, quote, faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States. Lieb and Sugarman argue that the same fiduciary obligations found in other areas of the law, in trusteeship law, should be impose the same constraints on self-dealing and conflicts of interest on the president. Finally, I've made an argument incorporating elements of both of the above in the context of the Mueller investigation. I argued that crimes like obstruction of justice, witness tampering, false statements, what we call process crimes, because they concern how an investigation or prosecution proceeds through the justice system, is a violation of the separation of powers by the executive because they implicate the integrity of the administration of justice as a whole, in which every branch has an interest and a role. Further, the intent required for these crimes, that the defendant acted corruptly, gets to the heart of whether or not the president has upheld his oath to ensure faithful execution of the laws. These theories can at least point the way towards a semi-bright line rule distinguishing appropriate instances of communication from inappropriate instances. I would define the distinction as one of policies versus politics. The former involve interests that are related to the functions of the executive office and its relationship to external goals or other branches. The latter involve interests that accrue to the person occupying the office. There remains the problem of the failure to pursue accountability, however. We saw this play out in the prelude to the first impeachment of President Trump. The Office of Legal Counsel at the Justice Department had written a secret legal opinion justifying the withholding of a whistleblower complaint from reaching Congress as the law required. Congress became aware of the whistleblower only after the Inspector General for the intelligence community went directly to Congress himself. Again, unlike the case of the overzealous prosecutor, who can be checked by the courts or through oversight, the case of a prosecutor who buries evidence to protect the executive is much harder to detect. I will return to that issue later. Let's turn to the second obstacle, levers of power. As I noted, establishing the theory of prosecutorial independence in the executive branch and how that should manifest in practice is the most complex aspect of the executive accountability problem. The other two are a bit more straightforward. The second obstacle is that the chief executive has at his disposal access to levers of power that can hinder and even neutralize attempts to investigate and prosecute him. Here I offer another Canadian example. The Aga Khan scandal, which rocked your country last year. To recap, in 2017, the Ethics Commissioner found Prime Minister Trudeau in violation of 4 provisions of the Conflict of Interest Act for accepting vacations, flights, and gifts from the Aga Khan, whose foundation had received $50 million in federal funding the year prior. However, the RCMP declined to pursue a criminal fraud investigation into the allegations, in part because as Prime Minister, Trudeau had the power to grant himself consent to receive gifts that would otherwise constitute fraud against the government. Did I get it right? Is that... I have to say, your scandals are so cute. You're worried about the Prime Minister taking vacations, and we're worried about a president who tried to overthrow the government and may have sold nuclear secrets to Saudi Arabia. Anyway, it must be nice. So the problem, the ability of the chief executive to grant reprieves from the application of the law, is a major impediment to the rule of law. In the United States, we've seen this play out with the many pardons granted by President Trump to people implicated in the investigation into his campaign's contacts with Russia leading up to the 2016 election. These included George Papadopoulos, Michael Flynn, Paul Manafort, and Roger Stone, all of whom lied to investigators or were convicted of making false statements to the FBI or Congress or obstruction of justice and were rewarded with a pardon. Trump also pardoned Steve Bannon, who had been charged in a separate investigation involving fraud related to a fundraising scam to build a wall along the southern border. Importantly, 3 of these individuals, Flynn, Stone, and Bannon, played a role in the events leading to the attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, which illustrates the ongoing consequences of the failure of accountability. Now, the pardon power is one of the few monarchical powers imported into the U.S. Constitution. It's a plenary power without any textual limitations. It would be impossible, in my opinion, for a pardon to constitute obstruction of justice, even if done with corrupt intent. Like the exception in the criminal code, which was available to Trudeau to exempt his trip from the applicable law, the pardon power acts effectively as a get-out-of-jail-free card for the executive, at least as it applies to those who do his dirty work for him. As far as the applicability of the pardon power to himself, meaning to the president, I'll offer a nightmare scenario. Trump, as former president, is charged and indicted, perhaps for obstruction of justice, perhaps for obstruction of Congress, or conspiracy to defraud the United States, or for violations of the Espionage Act. He is sent to jail. He runs for office in 2024 from jail and wins. On Inauguration Day, he takes the oath of office in his jail cell, and his first act as president is to grant himself a pardon. This would, at the very least, create a constitutional crisis. Can the president pardon himself? Most scholars say no. But then would he govern from a jail cell? And what happens until the Supreme Court decides the issue? Would it even get that far? In order for the self-pardon to be tested, the Attorney General who works for him would have to challenge it. I'd like to say that this scenario is outlandish, but when it comes to Trump, I've learned to never say never. The latest example of the executive leveraging his own power is Trump's claim that he declassified documents that were later found in his possession. There is no evidence he actually did that, but theoretically he could have, which would make prosecuting him under the Espionage Act difficult. Let's turn to the third obstacle. You'll see how I'm doing on time. The last obstacle we face in executive accountability is the criminal code itself. Specifically, the criminal code is not written or designed to cover the types of crimes that the chief executive may commit or that pose the greatest danger to the nation. Take, for example, Trump's campaign contacts with individuals connected to Russia, including Russian intelligence. not a crime, unless there was an explicit agreement to violate the U.S. Code, which would constitute criminal conspiracy. There was no evidence of such agreement, which isn't surprising when dealing with spies. Or Trump's withholding of aid to Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky in order to obtain an advantage in the 2020 election. Prosecutors and legal pundits, like me, debated the limits of statutes covering bribery or extortion, but they didn't really fit. And what did Trump get impeached for? In his first impeachment, abuse of power. Not a crime you'll find in the U.S. Criminal Code. In his second impeachment, incitement to insurrection. That is a crime found in the Criminal Code, but no one has been charged with that crime in recent memory, including any of the January 6th defendants. Many of them were convicted of seditious conspiracy, which is a different crime, not incitement. Even when there are crimes that fit the U.S. Code, it's difficult to disentangle the executive's exercise of power and the motive behind it. As you'll recall, the faithful execution test rests on the true motive behind the action. Did Trump fire Comey to stop an investigation into himself? Or because Comey had flouted Justice Department protocol in the handling of the Hillary Clinton case, which was the stated reason? Prosecutors may be loath to bring a prosecution that turns on the inner workings of someone's mind, particularly someone like Trump. Part of the reason that the U.S. Criminal Code is a blunt weapon for executive misconduct is that they are intended to be narrowly defined. In the United States, as I mentioned before, the current criminal code didn't emerge until the 20th century, largely because of state resistance to a national police force. Federal crimes are also crimes of general applicability. They are intended to apply to you and me and the guy who works at Starbucks, or in your case, Tim Hortons. Most important, what makes some crimes committed by the chief executive is not just what he did, but the position he holds while doing it. To use the Trump example, there are many people who could stand on a soapbox and exhort people to attack the U.S. Capitol. But there are few people who would have the power to make people act on those words. And the President of the United States is one of them. A seminal 1952 Supreme Court case, Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company versus Sawyer, summed it up as follows, I quote, "Executive power has the advantage of concentration in a single head, in whose choice the whole nation has a part, making him the focus of public hopes and expectations. In drama, magnitude, and finality, his decisions so far overshadow any others that almost alone he fills the public eye and ear. No other personality in public life can begin to compete with him in access to the public mind through modern methods of communications. By his prestige as head of state and his influence upon public opinion, he exerts a leverage upon those who are supposed to check and balance his power, which often cancels their effectiveness." End quote. The President of the United States and the chief executive of most countries has a singular influence and power that heightens the impact of their actions, making them more important and also more dangerous. And yet, Congress can't be expected to imagine and criminalize every possible abuse of power that would ultimately apply to only one person. How do we address these tensions? I want to turn now to some ways to address these obstacles. Some of these are things that we already have in practice, and some are ideas for things that we could implement. None of them completely solve the tension between the goals of independence and accountability, but they do come closer to closing the gaps. The first solution gets to the problem of the executive as enforcer and creating a buffer between the chief executive and the person investigating him. You've heard the term a lot, especially in recent weeks. It seems like everyone has one these days. It's the special counsel. But to understand what special counsels do now, it's important to understand a little history. The idea of a special prosecutor, which is what they were originally called, someone who is brought in to investigate a case from outside the government, actually goes back to 1875. After that, 5 more presidents, including Roosevelt and Truman, appointed special prosecutors. But they were all to investigate misconduct by government officials, not the president himself, until Richard Nixon. In 1973, following the Watergate break-in, Nixon's appointee for Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, agreed during his confirmation hearing to appoint a special prosecutor to investigate the case. He appointed Archibald Cox. When Cox obtained a grand jury subpoena for Nixon's White House tapes, Nixon ordered the Attorney General to fire him. Both the Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General resigned in what became known as the Saturday Night Massacre. The third in line at the Justice Department, Solicitor General Robert Bork, then fired Cox. Nixon proclaimed that the office of the special counsel had been abolished, but after public outcry, he appointed Leon Jaworski, who ultimately succeeded in obtaining the tapes, leading to Nixon's resignation. I'm telling you, it's really hard to get rid of a president. The aftermath of Watergate led to several reforms, one of them being the Ethics in Government Act of 1978. This created the Office of the Independent Counsel. Under the statute, a request to appoint an independent counsel could be made by Congress to the Attorney General. If the Attorney General agreed, a 3-judge panel would appoint the independent counsel. In many ways, this looks a lot like the autonomous institution model that we discussed earlier. Importantly, the independent counsel could only be fired for cause, like incapacitation or misconduct. The constitutionality of the independent counsel provision of the statute was challenged on separation of powers grounds, but upheld by the Supreme Court. But the precedent is a little shaky. And especially after the Clinton-Kenneth Starr debacle, which was widely viewed as an abuse of power by the independent counsel, this provision of the statute was allowed to expire when it sunsetted in 1999. So here we are. The special counsel today is created through regulations from within the Justice Department. It gives the Attorney General the power to appoint a special counsel when there is a conflict of interest and would be in the public interest. The Attorney General does not control day-to-day decisions of the special counsel, but must approve any major prosecutorial decisions taken by the special counsel, like executing a search warrant. The scope of the special counsel's authority is set out in the appointment letter and can only be expanded with the approval of the Attorney General. This is to avoid a repeat of Kenneth Starr, who began by investigating the Whitewater land deal, which no one understands what that was really about, and ended up with Monica Lewinsky. Finally, if the Attorney General overrules a prosecutorial decision, I'll come back, by the special counsel, she must report that they did so in writing to the House and Senate Judiciary Committees, along with the reasons for doing so. This prevents the Attorney General from burying a case while giving the appearance of having an independent prosecutor. The special counsel must also provide a written report at the end of his term, including the reasons for prosecuting or declining to prosecute the people investigated. This is important, as I mentioned before, that identifying when a prosecutor doesn't bring a case is difficult, and this addresses another way that a president in particular could be shielded. And these are just some photos. This is John Henderson, the first special prosecutor who was appointed by Ulysses S. Grant to investigate the whiskey ring scandal, which was a conspiracy between government agents and whiskey distillers to divert tax revenue to increase profits. The government agents were Republicans, Grant's own party, but when the investigation got too close to his secretary, Grant fired the special prosecutor. After public outcry, he appointed another one. This is Archibald Cox, the special prosecutor who was fired by Richard Nixon. Then the new one that was appointed, Leon Jaworski. And then these you all may be familiar with. We have Robert Mueller, then John Durham, who was appointed by Bill Barr to investigate the investigators. There's actually a New York Times article today about that investigation and whatever is going on with that. Jack Smith, who was appointed to investigate President Trump, and Robert Hur, up on the top right there, who has recently been appointed to investigate Biden's possession of classified documents. So if you want a special counsel, go talk to Merrick Garland. He'll probably give you one. So that is addressing the first obstacle. And this just summarizes some of the ways in which the special counsel regulations now tries to correct for both the excesses of the Nixon case and the excesses of the Kenneth Starr case, and tries to strike the balance. So I'll turn to the second obstacle I mentioned, that protocols surrounding the contact between the president and attorney general are governed by norms and not formal rules. And part of the reason is the potential constitutional and separation of powers problems in dictating the parameters of a president's communications with his inferior officers. The other part is that after Nixon, there seemed to be an understanding that there was an invisible red line that couldn't be crossed. Let me just make sure where I am. Okay. The Trump administration has changed all of that. Although his initial firing of FBI Director James Comey sent shockwaves across America and around the world and prompted comparisons to the Saturday Night Massacre, by the end of his administration, much of his behavior had been normalized and even defended by members of his own party. Consider that prior to January 6th, Trump's entire senior leadership at the Justice Department threatened to resign when he indicated an intent to fire his acting attorney general and replace him with Jeffrey Clark, an environmental attorney who was willing to do Trump's bidding in propagating false claims of voter fraud. Clark is now under federal investigation, but Trump has not suffered either a political or legal consequence for his actions. Sociologists have a term called cool trust. Essentially, when the norms of social trust and generalized reciprocity break down, meaning you can't count on your fellow citizens to act in a way that benefits the collective interest, that is, you have an increase in self-interested, corrupt behavior, then what used to be norms and conventions have to be formalized and enforced. We saw the first wave of this in the reforms after Nixon, where we formalized a lot of things that seemed obvious. I suggest two ways to formalize presidential norms concerning prosecutorial accountability. The first is to make explicit the role of the executive as a public fiduciary. What that means is that the office of the presidency is treated as a public trust. This would give operational effect to both the oath of office, which imposes an obligation to faithfully uphold the office of the presidency, and to ensure faithful execution of the laws. The tricky part is how to communicate this principle, what vehicle to use. Ideally, you would have courts interpret the Constitution and use the text of the document itself to constrain how the president exercises his power. For example, as Lieb and Sugarman suggest, to read a limitation on the pardon power that it cannot be used for self-serving purposes. But we have a trust problem now in the United States with the Supreme Court itself. So the other option is to legislate, perhaps through more narrowly defined criminal statutes intended to apply only to the office of the president. For example, a more specifically worded obstruction of justice statute. And this is a long shot, but such a limitation could also be achieved through a constitutional amendment. The second way to formalize norms more explicitly is to more explicitly articulate what constitute high crimes and misdemeanors for purposes of impeachment. High crimes and misdemeanors is what's the wording in the Constitution that give the grounds for impeachment, but they are not defined anywhere. This need not take the form of formal legislation. It could be a House resolution that lays out, similar to the criminal code, the specific types of behaviors and states of mind which would constitute high crimes and misdemeanors. This has the advantage of being entirely within the House's prerogatives and so constitutionally sound. It has the downside of not having much practical effect beyond placing the executive on notice and would be mostly symbolic. I should add that any such resolution would need to make clear that the list is not exhaustive. We have seen that presidents can find very creative ways to abuse their power. Finally, sorry, I did not put the animation into that, so I'll just put these up. Finally, I think it's important to increase attention to types of accountability beyond the criminal code. In the United States, we are obsessed with criminal liability. And I get it. There are certain people you really want to see in an orange jumpsuit. But using the criminal code as a yardstick can potentially enable evasion of executive accountability because it's not only narrow, it's a very high bar. The fact that something is not criminal doesn't make it right. We hope and expect our public officials to do more than not break the law. To that end, the following three mechanisms, which we have seen play out in the Trump administration, do have a place and value in any accountability scheme. I've already talked about impeachment. Most people look at the two impeachments of President Trump as failed impeachments. I disagree. While it's true that the Senate did not convict Trump in either one, he did get closer to that in the second one than the first, so that's progress. The articles of impeachment themselves were important. For one thing, impeachment by the House is a formal accusation of wrongdoing, the political analog of a criminal indictment. That is a powerful symbolic statement, especially when, as in the second impeachment, the votes for it are bipartisan. Second, there is stigma attached to being impeached, especially twice. Trump joins a very short list of presidents who have been impeached, which include only Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton. Finally, both the articles of impeachment and the evidence presented at a Senate trial create an important historical record and a precedent for future executive misconduct. The second form of accountability is congressional oversight. When done correctly and in a bipartisan manner, congressional investigations can hold the executive accountable in the court of public opinion, if not the court of law. We saw this play out powerfully with the January 6th committee hearings. Did those get televised here? It's important to remember that criminal indictments and trials are like the tip of the iceberg. You see only the evidence which is relevant to the specific charges at hand, and that can overcome barriers to admission, like the inadmissibility of hearsay. By contrast, congressional investigations can reveal the rest of the iceberg. They can be far-ranging, covering conduct that may not meet the bar for criminal liability, and present evidence that may not be admissible in court. Most importantly, they can be public and use vehicles like television and social media to inform and educate the public. It's important to remember that the televised hearings into Watergate were watched by 80 million people and were instrumental in changing public opinion and leading to Nixon's resignation. Finally, there are professional sanctions. This wouldn't apply in all cases, but over half of U.S. presidents have been lawyers. So disciplinary action is a potential avenue for accountability. Following his impeachment in the Monica Lewinsky scandal for lying under oath in a civil case, Bill Clinton's Arkansas law license was suspended, and he was fined $25,000 by the Arkansas State Board. He also faced disbarment from the Supreme Court, but resigned from that bar before the proceedings took place. He was also fined $90,000 for contempt of court by the judge who oversaw the civil case. These might seem like small potatoes, but the grievance process provides an avenue for documenting presidential misconduct, and is especially relevant when the conduct may involve ethical issues that don't rise to crimes. Professional sanctions can also provide a way to deter enablers of executive misconduct who may be counting on a pardon to shield them criminally. Right now, for example, disbarment proceedings are ongoing against Jeffrey Clark, that's the environmental lawyer who was going to run with the coup attempt, and his lawyers, Trump's lawyers, Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell. All of these individuals may face criminal penalties, but if Trump returns to office, he would be able to pardon them. Disbarment would prevent them from trying to engage in the same type of activity on Trump's behalf again in the future. Most of them tried to bring cases and argue make legal arguments in court to perpetuate the idea of voter fraud. So I will rest my case, as it were, on that note. I hope I've laid out some of the complexities involved in establishing prosecutorial independence when it comes to holding the chief executive accountable, and highlighted some paths forward. And I'm happy to take questions.